Welcome back to the channel. This is Ready Storm and you are watching What If Naruto Found Dark Knowledge of Forgotten Past. If you enjoy this video, please like, share and subscribe to this channel. Not wasting no more time, let's start the story.
With the exception of the shinobi who were on night watch anyhow, the majority of the village had retired for the night in Konohagakure. However, a lone light continued to flicker from an Uzumaki Naruto's bedroom in one of the village's more dilapidated areas. His fourth birthday had been almost a week ago, and while it had gone by like most others, this one had been a little different. That light continued to shine from his window because of this. To put it plainly, he had received a gift, a book, specifically, for the first time in his life. And what a book it was, filled with tales of elves, orcs, and other creatures, as well as heroic knights and wizards from long ago. He also discovered that he just could not put it down, even though he had only recently learned to read. Additionally, it was on this night that he would discover a tale that would alter not only his life but also the lives of people everywhere. It was the book's final one and told the story of a villainous knight who attempted to wipe out the world with his undead army. The epic battle that took place at the top of the world, where the evil knight was ultimately vanquished, explained how all the races of the world had united to stop him. The stories in the book had all been so captivating that he was almost disappointed to have finished reading them all. However, out of all the characters and stories in the book, one had captured his interest the most. Sylvanas, the Banshee Queen. Despite her brief appearances, he couldn't help but feel a certain bond with her and her abandonment. He somehow understood how someone like them might feel. He could only assume that these abandoned would receive much the same treatment as he did, given the sense of loneliness and the appearance. But since it was getting late, he intended to visit the Sandaime tomorrow to demonstrate that he had completed the book he had given him. He swiftly turned off the light and fell into a sound sleep after taking one last look at the object that had captured his attention for the previous week. The following day, Naruto got up early and hurried through his morning routine in order to reach the Hokage Tower as soon as possible. He was hurrying as quickly as his 4-year-old legs would allow him to because the old man had promised him something. If there was one thing that could inspire Naruto, it was the promise of free ramen, which he had made when he first gave him the book for his birthday and promised to take him out for ramen after he had finished reading it. Anyway, 30 minutes later, Naruto hurried out of the apartment building where he resided and headed toward the Hokage Tower in the center of the village. Thankfully, it was still early and not many people were out yet, which only served to highlight his uniqueness. No matter where he went in the village, he always ended up on the same stairs, which had been bothering him for a while. It was finally starting to get to him. He would have simply shrugged and continued walking if it had only been a few people, but it was strange for the entire village, aside from 2 or 3, to stare at him with such coldness, and he wished he knew why. He chose to ignore that thought and go on his way to the tower and the promise of free ramen because it was unlikely that he would receive an answer simply by standing off to one side of the road. In fact, it was unlikely that he would receive any kind of response regardless of what he did. Before Sarutobi could hear the sound of a scuffle outside his office door, he had just settled down to his first cup of tea. Though he was curious as to why the boy was here so early, this was not particularly novel. A flash of bright blonde hair appeared shortly after the double doors to his office exploded open, just a few minutes later. The little ball of energy made him smile, and he had to fight the urge to smile. He asked, letting some of his amusement seep into his voice, "Well, now don't you think it's a bit early to be breaking into my office, Naruto?" Naruto simply laughed at his own impatience and rubbed the back of his head, but he immediately put on the most serious face he could manage, recalling the promise of free ramen. He nodded his head and said, "It's never too early for ramen, old man, especially when it's free ramen." The elderly Hokage looked at the boy doubtfully and said, "Oh, and just where is this free ramen coming from?" The boy had attempted to get free ramen from him before, and if he gave in to him every time he felt like eating there, he would go bankrupt in a week. As if it were the most straightforward thing in the world, Naruto answered, "From you, of course." It was a bit of a white lie on his part. He had only promised him 2 bowls of ramen, but he was hoping the old man had forgotten that small detail. "You promised, remember? You said that when I finished the book you gave me you would buy me as much ramen as I could eat." It was as if he asked himself, "Oh, did I?" The young blonde's expression of horror was priceless, and it took all of his years of shinobi training to maintain a straight face. "That really doesn't sound like me. Are you sure you didn't just imagine that?" he asked. No, I remember, you promised to buy me 2 cups of ramen if I finished the book you gave me." You can't just forget and leave me ramenless. It'd be a crime against humanity, I tell you. A crime. The brunette screamed at the top of his chest. With an air of bewilderment, the cage repeated, well, now that you bring it up, I do seem to remember something about promising someone 2 free bowls of ramen. But one thought you said I promised you as much as you could eat? Naruto couldn't help but congratulate himself on his recovery, saying, ah well, you see, it's just that, I meant to say 2 bowls but, one was so excited about finishing the book you gave me that I just said the first thing that came to mind. As the boys recovered, Sarutobi couldn't help but smile. For a shinobi, the ability to lie was crucial, and while eventually he would have to confront the blonde about lying to him, for the time being it was good practice, and even if it was only subliminally, he was improving. Most 4-year-olds were not able to shift the conversation away from his lie to something else. Oh, you're finished already. Well, that is impressive. I can see why you would be so excited and make a small slip of the tongue. Unaware that he had been holding his breath, Naruto released it. With a contagious smile, the blonde remarked, yeah, it was kind of difficult at first but the stories are so exciting that I just couldn't put it down. Sarutobi smiled back, well, I'm glad you enjoyed it so much. He saw the boy as his own grandson and was genuinely delighted for him. But tell me, what was your favorite part? Naruto was unsure of how to respond. His favorite moments were when Sylvanas or one of the Forsaken spoke, even though they weren't mentioned in the book very often. At last, he made up his mind, and Naruto responded with some conviction. I liked the last story the best, the one with the evil knight. Really? When I was little I always liked the one about the white knight that fought to protect his home, Sarutobi replied sincerely. A slightly amazed Naruto questioned, you mean you read the same stories when you were younger? All Sarutobi could do was laugh at the young boy in front of him. Yes, in fact that book I gave you used to belong to me when I was younger. The little blonde exclaimed, wow, that's so awesome. He was amazed that the book that had already become his most treasured possession had become even more so. But it was at that moment that he became aware that he had nearly forgotten why he had come. The blonde pointed an accusing finger at the Hokage and yelled, wait a minute. I know what's going on. You're trying to divert me so I'll forget about the free ramen you promised. The old cage lied, saying, no Naruto, it's nothing like that. After all, it would hardly be fair if he had to tell the truth if he was going to allow the blonde ball of energy in front of him to get away with lying. After giving the elderly man a questioning glance, Naruto gave a cheerful response. Then that means we can go now, right? His brow started to perspire as he made a valiant effort to think of something that would please the boy while keeping the majority of his money in his wallet. Yes, he was aware that he had only committed to purchasing the blonde 2 bowls of ramen, but he hadn't become a ninja this long by being a fool. Before he knew it, he would have to sell his house to cover Naruto's ramen tab. 2 bowls would soon become 4, and 4 would become 8. However, inspiration struck during this desperate moment. Yes, it was brilliant. He just sent one of the numerous chunin to order 2 bowls of takeout, which would prevent the little ramen vacuum from ordering more and give him the tab. However, it would take some time because he would have to divert the boy's attention long enough for the chunin to get the ramen. After taking a quick look at said bond, he realized that he would have to think of something fast or his plan would fail. He was truly on a roll today, and inspiration struck once more. The child was about to object loudly, as was to be expected, saying, that sounds like an excellent idea, Naruto, but I still have a few things to do here first. However, he said hastily, I think there might be another book of stories in my library just down the hall. I'm sure that by the time you find it that I'll be more than ready to buy you your 2 bowls of ramen. I'll even let you keep the new book as well, seeing as how you finished the first one so fast. For someone who had seen too much of the world like himself, the way the boys' faces brightened at the prospect of hearing more stories like the others was genuinely heartwarming. He only wished he had more time to witness it. The blonde was hurried out his office door in less than a second. Before long, the blonde was gazing in wonder at the room that was crammed with books of all sizes. The sight of so many books was more than enough to make him gasp because he had never been permitted to visit the public library. But he didn't have to think about it for long. How will I ever locate the book that the elderly man mentioned? He approached the first book stack he saw with great hesitancy. In my opinion, advanced economics is not for beginners. He didn't even have a sword, much less polish for one, and there were 101 uses for sword polish. This process went on for a while until he reached the far wall, where something that had finally caught his attention was concealed between two bookshelves. Ichi Ichi Paradise, that title didn't even make sense. He read aloud from his personal journal of Master Apothecary Farinel. He had paused before he could recall why that name had sounded so familiar. In the final story of his book, a character had mentioned him in passing. In fact, it had been about a man named Master Apotheker Farah, but he blamed that on someone making a mistake. Seeing that the book was heavily covered in dust, he tentatively picked it up and turned to the first page to check if it was indeed the same person. He believed it to be so, but in any case, Farinel's name was printed prominently on the first page, followed by the words, "Humble servant to the Dark Lady of the Forsaken Sylvanas Windrunner." He was overjoyed to discover a book about the Forsaken. All he had hoped for was a few more references to them. With the prospect of free noodles never far from his mind, he hurriedly tucked his prize inside his jacket and headed back to the old man's office. When Naruto entered his tiny apartment, he was not in the best of moods because the elderly man had deceived him. To keep himself occupied long enough to place his ramen order, he must have hidden the book there. As he reached into his jacket and took out the dusty book, he told himself, oh well, at least the day wasn't a total bust. Choosing to ignore the fact that he had only been able to eat 2 bowls of ramen, he hurried into his room, settled in, and began reading his new book. He casually observed that the author of Personal Journal of Master Apothecary Farinel Humble Servant to the Dark Lady of the Forsaken Sylvanas Windrunner had clearly taken the time to make Sylvanas' name much more elegantly written than the rest of the text. The irony of it is that, although I write this with the intention that it never be read, I can already see our people gradually going extinct. If I could still laugh, I would definitely be laughing right now. But now is not the moment for my remaining sense of humor to show up. There is much to say and there is never a shortage of time. Perhaps I am being too quick, but I do hope you are not a human. You are a cursed creature, and I detest everything about them, even the thought of them. Excuse me, but once again, I have allowed my remaining emotions to get in the way of something much more significant than my own feelings. Whatever you are, you now possess what is probably one of the few surviving pieces of our once great civilization. However, your knowledge of our great race may be severely lacking depending on how long this book has been lost, misplaced, or locked away. I'm sure that any records of me would have been forgotten long before that. Thus, let me introduce myself. I'm Farinel, and I honestly can't recall my last name, so don't bother asking. In any event, no matter how painful it is for me to admit it, I was once a wizard of Dalaran. If you have never heard of such a place, don't worry. It's just a crater in the ground now. In any event, my death is more significant to our current conversation than my life. I don't want to bore you with the meaningless specifics of my demise. Let's just say it happened rather quickly and wasn't completely unpleasant. However, it seems that Artus, that damned monster, had decided that was not going to happen. Before continuing, I felt that I had to honestly convey how much I detest that man, which is hard for me to do because all the words I can think of pale in comparison to how much I detest him. However, in this epiphany, I believe I can finally put my complete hatred of the man into words. Yes, I believe I can say that I detest that monster even more than I detest humans, even more than the entire human race combined. But enough of that, my death was not to come, and shortly after, I became one of the mindless scourges. This was a real nightmare for someone with my level of intelligence. But eventually, Artus's hold on me waned, and I was soon out of his grasp. My rebirth had left me, though, for obvious reasons. Let's just say that my body had seen better days, but not long after, I met my future queen, my Dark Lady, and I knew then and there that I would gladly devote my life's work to whatever she desired. I worked tirelessly for her until the very end, but unfortunately, I was unable to realize her dreams, and now I fear it is too late, that even though I am afraid to say it, a miracle could save us at this point. The world's eyes were on us because of the traitor Putris's betrayal, and even we were unable to hide our secrets from them. May he suffer eternally in whatever awaits him beyond death's door. The Alliance is now marching up the gates of our great Undercity after the Horde left us, and I fear that not even of my dear Sylvanas will be sufficient to carry us through. Whoever you are now aware of the fate that most likely befell us, and knowing those naive people as well as I do, I am confident that what you are holding is probably the most comprehensive collection of records, research notes, biological samples, stored in suspended animation on a heavily enchanted page at the end of the book, my own notes, and the notes and diagrams from every other experiment the Royal Apothecary Society has conducted over the years. Due to time constraints, we were only able to collect this information, which is far from comprehensive. I give you all of this. You can now use it however you like. P.S. I hope that if you are human, you use the knowledge in this book to kill yourself and your entire vile race. With his 4-year-old mind racing, Naruto could only stare down at the book he was holding and try to make sense of what he had read. He could see now that this was no fairy tale, that this Farinel had once been a real person. As he hurriedly turned the pages, he discovered that the book was chock full of images and words that he could hardly understand, let alone pronounce. It was all too much for him to process at once, and his head was beginning to spin. After hyperventilating for a few minutes, he eventually regained consciousness. He couldn't help but smile as he looked down at the book he had dropped on the floor in his confusion. In all honesty, he didn't know what even a fourth of the words in the book meant, but he was prepared to learn them in order to gain a better understanding of this Farinel man. In addition, he had always desired a secret of his own, and now he had something valuable to keep to himself. He quickly picked up the book and laid it gently on his nightstand before hurrying off to get some pencils and paper. All right, so I have this awesome book, but I can't read it. How can I make this work? He asked himself this question before writing down every thought that came to him. He scratched his head, trying to come up with another idea. Well, I could just show Hokage. Gee, but I want to keep this my secret, so that's out. Well, I don't have one of those books, but there's always that other one that's full of words and what they mean. With a plan in place, he swiftly returned to the journal. Perhaps I can get the old man to get me one. Yay, I can just tell him some of the words are too tough for me and ask for that other book. As he slowly turned the pages, he told himself, well, I might not be able to understand the words, but I can at least look at the pictures. About halfway through the book, he came across a picture of something that was definitely undead, which was far more attractive than the previous few. At first, he was shocked and more than a little disgusted to see that the majority of them were pictures of dead things. He added that all the other pictures in the book were not nearly as well done. It showed a tall woman standing in a dimly lit room, thought that only seemed to make her dark red eyes shine all the brighter. I won't go into detail about what she's wearing and the like. You should all know what she looks like, if not just Google it. As he looked at the photo again, he also noticed the caption, Lady Sylvana's Windrunner. So this is what she looked like, he thought to himself. He spent the next few hours doing this, looking at the pictures and trying to decipher some of the words as he turned the pages of the book. However, he soon realized that night was falling and that he wanted to rise early the following day. After giving the old book one last glance, he put it gently on the table next to his bed and fell asleep right away, not even realizing the quiet laughter echoing in his own head. It was challenging, but the great fox had to deliberately suppress its laughter so the boy wouldn't find it out. It was almost too good to be true that his container had been the one to discover this. He was almost relieved that he had been sealed inside the boy, just thinking about what the boy could do with this knowledge. However, he was certain that no one else could ever hope for a more entertaining host than him. However, that was the issue, wasn't it? Everything depended on the boy and his actions, even though the situation promised death and bloodshed. He had considered calling the boy to him but decided against it because it was too dangerous, because the little hairless monkey might be scared off and he might stop out of spite if he seemed to support the boy's studying. Sadly, he was limited in what he could accomplish from behind his cage's bars. Increasing the amount of his chakra that seeped into the boy's system was the best he could do. Unfortunately, the little flesh bag was still young, and giving him too much would probably kill them both. Instead, it would need to be very little, just enough to intensify the darker feelings of the boys. This plan was also dangerous because if the boy's emotions changed too quickly, people might start to suspect him. All it would take is a glance at the boy's chakra to know that he was up to something and that he really didn't want to consider what might happen. With a plan in place, the great fox closed his eyes slowly and visualized all the suffering and death his host would cause in the world. His face gradually lit up with a smile. This was going to be hilarious. In the 2 years since he discovered Farinel's journal, he had rapidly come to the conclusion that the man was a genius, a sick, deranged, and completely malevolent genius, but a genius nonetheless. The majority of the ideas in the book were completely beyond his understanding even after 2 years of studying virtually non-stop. However, he was pleased to report that he was beginning to grasp some of the simpler ideas. Unfortunately, his current issue would not be resolved by any of the information in the book. When he had to solve a problem, he did what he always did. He quickly collected Farinel's journal and a few books, carefully putting them in his old backpack. After that, he went to his tiny refrigerator, took out some juice and some bread, and carefully placed them in his bag. He quickly surveyed his apartment after packing and sighed at its condition. Since it was peaceful and offered one of the best views of the village, he was baffled as to why no one ever seemed to climb up here. He didn't mind, though, because he would have to find somewhere else to go think if everyone started coming here. However, he was not here to ponder the mysteries of why people did what they did, so he swiftly dismissed the thought and sat down on the Yondaimi's head as usual. No, he was here to consider one of the many issues that have been being addressed lately. In fact, the most pressing issue at the moment was one of the easier ones. He concluded that there was a lot of stuff sealed away in the back of the book, so much so that he doubted he could fit it all in his small apartment, let alone keep it a secret, even though he couldn't understand most of it. Finding a large abandoned building that he could call his own was the obvious solution, but it was turning out to be more difficult to locate than he had initially anticipated. He had begun searching for a place near his apartment. The neighborhood as a whole appeared to be in disrepair, so he assumed there would be many old buildings that he could convert. Regretfully, he wasn't alone in thinking this because the first building he discovered that appeared to be abandoned was anything but. Whether it was a shinobi village or not, crime was a problem in all big towns, and it appeared that the local gangs had taken possession of the majority of the abandoned building. He had been fortunate enough to escape unnoticed. He then gave the commercial district a try. However, he had failed to locate anything appropriate once more, and because the place was so packed, he was certain that someone would have eventually discovered his hiding place. It was nearly the same size as his apartment, but the only place that appeared even remotely usable was an old, deserted cabin outside the village wall in one of the wooded areas. Regretfully, the small log cabin remained his best choice despite nearly 4 weeks of searching. Naruto sighed at his lack of options and promptly started pacing back and forth while occasionally looking at the village, searching his mind for a solution to the problem that had baffled him for the past month. Nothing in 5 minutes. 20 and still nothing. He was prepared to concede defeat and just get by with the little room the old cabin would give him after 2 hours of pacing back and forth. He turned his back on the village and began to descend the mountain, hastily gathering his books and the remnants of the food he had brought. It said to get dark outside, but that wasn't usually an issue because he had done this climb so many times that he was certain he could do it while wearing a blindfold. However, he was too preoccupied with his personal issues to realize that he had veered off course and was now moving farther into the woods that gave the village its name. After nearly 30 minutes of walking, he finally realized that he was in a new area of the forest and that it was growing dark outside. He muttered to himself, "Well, at least it's not raining." Unfortunately, even though it wasn't raining, the weather was growing chilly. Making a fire was the first thing he had to do after quickly determining that he would have to spend the night in the forest. He therefore set out to find firewood with a clear goal in mind. But this was easier said than done, and as the sun dipped further below the horizon, it was getting harder to stay upright, let alone find a suitable fire starter. But after a short while, he had collected a respectable amount of wood and was now only looking for a suitable location to set up camp for the night. Unfortunately, he was so blinded by the darkness that he was unable to see the root that had just entangled his leg, sending him and his firewood plummeting down the steep slope of the ravine he had been following. Unfortunately, the walls of the ravine he had fallen down were too steep to climb up, even though the fall wasn't very long. Shaking his head and complaining about how unfair everything was, he hurried to his feet and looked around again. Since he could still see no way up, he concluded that the only thing he could do was to begin walking until he found a location that he could climb up. He believed he was making good time and was certain that eventually he would find a place to climb up, even though it was getting very late and the deep shadows of the ravine were not helping. But that's when he realized something wasn't quite right. Fortunately, the ravine he had been laboring through had not been wet, but something appeared to be reflecting the scant moonlight up ahead. Now that he was curious, Naruto accelerated his pace until he was standing in front of the last thing he had anticipated finding in this wilderness. With the exception of a few areas that appeared to have been where the moonlight had been reflecting, the large metal door was nearly entirely rusted. This would have been an understatement to say that Naruto was perplexed. It was unusual to run across random doors in the forest, even in a ninja village. Nevertheless, there had to be a door leading somewhere, and wherever that was, it was probably preferable to sleeping outside. He was able to open the door with a great deal of effort. Even though it was much darker inside than it was outside and the air smelled stale, as if he had been the first person to open the door in years, he still went inside and began his journey into the unknown by using his hand to follow the wall. After only a few moments of walking, his hand brushed against a well-known bump in the wall. It was a switch for lights. He flipped it, momentarily blinded by the sudden light, having quickly decided that he had had enough of stumbling around in the dark for one night. It was brief, and upon opening his eyes, he was met with the view of a spacious room. With just a few damaged chairs and boxes for decoration, the room itself wasn't particularly striking. Nevertheless, he did notice another door at the far end of the room after taking a quick glance around. Once more, his curiosity overcame him, and he walked to the other door, noticing absently that it was a large, likely thick, metal door similar to the one he had discovered in the ravine. Compared to the previous one, this one was much simpler to open. This door led to a lengthy corridor once more. It was gratefully lit this time, but unlike the previous time, there were several doors on the left side of the hall. He checked the majority of these doors quickly. The majority of them only lead to a smaller room that contains several old cots. He could only assume that the second last door led to a hospital room, though there was barely enough space for a desk and 2 beds. He also saw that some of the books were covered in dust. He hurried to them and began leafing through them. There were no surprises because they were all medical texts. He decided that no one would notice if he took them for himself and placed them in his bag with the rest of his belongings after noticing the dust they had accumulated. He couldn't see the bottom of the long, winding staircase that led to the hall's final door. He wasn't going to stop now, though, because he had come this far. Reaching the bottom of the stairs took him a little longer than he had anticipated. Another door, identical to the others, was located at the bottom. Once more, he opened the door to find himself in a lengthy hallway that resembled the one he had just left. But as he approached the first door, he saw the difference right away. Whereas the previous doors had all been made of metal, this one and seemingly the others seemed to be made of some sort of glass or plastic. In addition, the lock appeared to be different. Previously, every door had a basic doorknob or, in the case of the front door, a wheel that needed to be turned. However, these appeared to be magnetic, with a tiny switch next to each door. Overall, he found them to be somewhat cool. There were 6 doors like this in total, and behind each one was an empty space that appeared to be large enough to accommodate 2 or 3 people. When he finally reached the final door, he saw that it was a big metal door with a wheel for a handle. Like the others, this one opened without any issues, and the first thing he saw must have been the biggest room he had ever seen. He stepped out slowly onto the catwalk that ran the length of the room's exterior wall. Several other walkways connected the 2 sides. He could see that the large room was divided by several walls when he looked down, but it was interesting to note that many of the rooms had ceilings made of what appeared to be the same clear glass or plastic as the doors in the other hall. As he slowly made his way around the catwalk, he was struck by how enormous the room was. He could barely see the far side. After nearly 10 minutes of walking, he finally arrived at the back of the room, where a large rectangular building hung above the other rooms. Naruto thought it was funny that a building was inside another building. He was once more in front of one of the numerous metal doors that appeared to be the distinguishing feature of whatever location this was. As he opened the door, he saw that this area of the complex appeared to have retained its original appearance. Several chairs and desks ran the length of the walls, undamaged but covered in inches of dust. Along the rear wall was a row of filing cabinets as well. To his right, there was a wooden door in the center of the wall, flanked by 2 desks. He pondered for a moment, deciding that he would probably have to return through this location to exit, and then he moved over to the only wooden door he had seen since he had begun exploring. He was torn between going over to the other door and looking through any files that might have been left in the filing cabinets. The office was the only possible explanation. Aside from the dust, it was in perfect condition on the other side of the door. More filing cabinets were arranged primarily along the left wall. His attention was drawn to the right, where a floor.to ceiling bookcase was nearly entirely stocked with books and extended from one corner of the room to the other. A large oak desk with an equally large leather chair behind it stood in the middle of the room. Behind that, the rear wall was almost entirely composed of large windows that gazed down on the entire spacious room from which he had just emerged. He couldn't help but notice the name plate that was primarily positioned at the front of the desk as he walked forward to it. He picked it up carefully and blew off what must have been years' worth of dust from the dull metal plate. Naruto read the words, "Warden Haro say this," aloud. At this point, it was beginning to make a lot of noise. He had discovered an old prison of some sort. His heart was suddenly overcome with irrational fear. What if he got himself locked up in here? Nobody knew he was here. In fact, it's likely that most people were unaware that anything was here at all. Nevertheless, the fear quickly subsided. Since he had gotten down here so easily, it was unlikely that getting out would be any more difficult. He inhaled and exhaled several times to relax, then focused on the rear wall and the view it offered. Suddenly, his previous issue resurfaced, and he chastised himself for not considering this sooner. This location was ideal. Here, he had more than enough room to do anything he pleased. Since it was a prison, it was likely safer than many locations in the village, but he would need to address the issue of only being able to walk in. He was confident that he was now the proud owner of the coolest clubhouse in the entire village, even though there was still a lot of work to be done and it would likely take him a month to dust the place. Thus, the young blonde curled up in the old dusty office and fell asleep with a big smile on his face. How the old man had persuaded him that this was a good idea was still a mystery to him. Indeed, being able to defend himself had value, but mastering chakra was even more valuable. He shuddered to consider how much his own studies would suffer as a result of having to spend a significant amount of his day cooped up in the academy. However, there was always the possibility that he would make a friend, and in all honesty, that was most likely the only reason he had ever agreed to anything. The new school year had begun, and it had been nearly a month since he had that conversation. He then found himself strolling through Konoha's streets, something he had been doing less and less of in recent years. Unfortunately, he could still feel the icy glances the villagers gave him, suggesting that their feelings toward him had not changed in his absence. He could acknowledge, however, that they no longer caused him as much pain, primarily because, as the years passed and he isolated himself from the rest of the village, his need for their approval had diminished and his motivation to divert their attention had diminished. However, he was honest enough to acknowledge his loneliness, if only to himself. But as he got closer to the front of the big academy building, his thoughts abruptly stopped. However, the large crowd of people gathered outside the building was the reason he stopped, not the building itself. Naruto could now confidently declare that he was no idiot. After all, he was currently working on discovering scientific theorems that Kami had forgotten for an indeterminate amount of time, so he was certain that it would not be ideal for him to make an appearance at this time. He chose to look out a side door since it didn't appear that the big crowd would be leaving anytime soon. Fortunately, there were many doors in a building this size, and he had found one quickly. He eventually found the school registry and the room he was supposed to go to after a few minutes of fruitless searching. Iruka was presumably as nauseous as his new students on the first day of the new semester. In addition to having more than a few clan heirs in his class, this would be his first year as the lead instructor rather than merely a teacher assistant. Nevertheless, he believed he was a good teacher and was determined to demonstrate that he was more than capable of the position. And he started getting his new classroom ready for the influx of young people that would soon swarm it with this idea in mind. He had just finished reviewing some of the lesson plans he had been working on for the previous few weeks when he heard the door open. Even though he was aware that class would begin in a few minutes, it was still extremely uncommon for someone to arrive early for their first day of classes. He put his trademark teacher smiles on his face and turned to greet his first new student, but he had no intention of discouraging one of his students from arriving early. But when he saw the young boy standing in the doorway, he was forced to stop. Although it was strange to see a new academy student wearing what appeared to be a modified lab coat with an Anbu style shirt and paint combination underneath, it wasn't what he was wearing. The boy's complexion was also far too pale. No, the fact that Kitsune had just entered his classroom with the Kyuubi container was what had prevented him from even noticing these things. Even though he had mostly moved past his resentment of the event from all those years ago, it was still quite another to witness the embodiment of a natural disaster enter his classroom. However, he promptly interrupted that line of thought. He took pride in being intelligent enough to control his emotions because he was a teacher. The boy was the nine-tailed fox's Jinchuriki, but that didn't necessarily mean they were the same person. Thus, after exerting some effort, he composed himself and spoke to his pupil. He congratulated himself on maintaining his composure and said, "Hello, my name is Amino Iruka, but in class you'll call me Iruka. Sensei or just sensei." Compared to most children his age, the little blonde said, Hi. I'm Naruto, Uzumaki Naruto. I guess I'm a little early." However, Iruka was confident that this would change once he felt more at ease with him. Iruka waved his hand to the side of the classroom where the students would sit and said, "Well then Naruto, since you were the first here, I guess you get first choice of seats." Before scanning the rest of the class, the blonde simply gave him a questioning glance. Before heading to one of the desks at the rear of the class, the blonde said somewhat uncertainly, "Thanks. Anyway, it was nice to meet you, Iruka. Sensei." Iruka was only able to look at his new student for a brief moment before the sound of several feet in the hallways signaled that the other students would soon follow. The other students in his class had quickly filed in. Even though he wasn't very good at reading people, he could already tell how strong they were. He might be smarter than most of the students in the class, but there were plenty of people here who could kick his ass without much difficulty. He told himself, well, that's what happens when you spend 90% of your time trying to solve the mysteries of a lost science. Aside from the fact that the majority of them were too loud for his taste, it was still far too early to begin passing any kind of judgment on them. Even so, he was reasonably certain that he could identify those who were at least paying some attention to this after just 5 minutes. First, there was the other boy who had sat in the back near him. He didn't know what his name was, but he was easily recognized because he was wearing sunglasses inside. He also received a lot of praise because he was most likely the only other person in the room who wasn't chattering inanely. Another boy was seated in the front row as well. At least he was speaking at a far more reasonable level than the majority of the other children, even though he may not have had a very positive opinion of him. Unfortunately, he could only find 2 examples of what he believed should be the norm for students learning to be robbers and assassins. However, he had been essentially living in a cave for the previous 2 years and had never considered becoming a shinobi until a few months ago, so what did he know? He hadn't really been listening to the man when he introduced himself, though, and the teacher, Iruka, seemed to have decided that the rest of the class had had enough time to socialize and motioned for them to stop talking before he could return to studying his classmates. With only a handful pausing their discussions, the rest of the class, however, appeared to have simply ignored him. Naruto would then remember that, if his guess was correct, he had seen his first jutsu, genjutsu. "Everyone sit down and stop talking," was a memorable moment for all of them when they first saw the demon head jutsu. It only took a few seconds for everyone who hadn't already found a seat to do so and for the conversation to stop. Unexpectedly, this resulted in Naruto getting a neighbor for the seat to his right. He glanced at the individual and saw that her hair was blonde, but much lighter than his own. Some students groaned, but for the most part, everyone kept their thoughts to themselves because the picture of the demon head jutsu was still vivid in their minds. Good. Now that we're all in our seats, I'd like to welcome you all to your first year at the Konoha Shinobi Academy. Now then, before we start, I think it would be a good idea for all of us to introduce ourselves, seeing as we're going to be spending so much time together. Now, seeing as how I'm going to be teaching you for the next 4 years, I'll start. My name's Amino Iruka, but in class you'll call me Iruka. Sensei. I like going to onsen and my goal is to make you all the best ninja you can be. Now why don't you start us off? He then directed the individual on the left side of the seat. Though he was mostly distracted by the introductions, a few did grab his attention, though some of those were more the result of the loudness than the content. However, at least he now knew the names of some of the people he hoped to make friends with. Specifically, the Sasuke Uchiha boy he had seen sitting in the front earlier. He sounded a little cocky, but so did the majority of the other boys in the class. Additionally, he managed to identify the boy wearing sunglasses as Shino Aburame, and even though he most likely only used 5 of his 6 words to introduce himself, he had made a good impression on Naruto and seemed like someone he would enjoy hanging out with. But he was too preoccupied with trying to evaluate the other students' introductions to realize that it was his turn. Iruka exclaimed, "Hem," as he cleared his mind. "Naruto, it's your turn to introduce yourself now." He swore, Stupid brain, always overthinking things. Now everyone's going to think I'm a moron. Ah, right. My names are Uzumaki Naruto and I like learning new things. As for a goal, well, I'm still working on that. He had been largely honest. He did enjoy learning new things, but he couldn't really say that he wanted to outperform Farinell as an apothecary. But at that moment, a loud voice interrupted his inner monologue. As the boy with the little white puppy on his head exclaimed, "Ha! I like learning new things. Guess we found the new teacher's pet." Naturally, this had the desired effect, as the majority of the class burst out laughing. Naruto muttered under his breath, "Philistine." Kiba shouted at the top of his lungs, "What the hell did you call me?" He responded as calmly as he could, but the loud idiot was making it difficult for him to control his temper. "I called you a Philistine, you Philistine." He responded with a hint of smugness. "What the hell kind of insult is that? It's not even a word. I guess that makes you the idiot now, doesn't it, having to make up words? You really are a moron." No one made fun of his intelligence, so that had undoubtedly been the last straw. "It is a word, you moron," he snapped back. He had stopped talking, but probably more out of confusion than anything else. "Though I should apologize for using such a big word. It was obviously presumptuous of me to have assumed that your obviously underdeveloped brain could handle something as complex as basic language." At that moment, he became aware that everyone else in the room was looking directly at him. Well, fuck, first impressions are so preposterous. Iruka took advantage of the lull in the argument to put a greater end to it. "Alright, you two, that's more than enough. Kiba, don't call your classmates morons, and Naruto, I don't care what someone calls you, you shouldn't call them a Philistine. Now then, seeing as we've now all been introduced, I think it would be good to go over just what you all can expect to learn over the course of the year. First, we'll be working on your basic skills, reading, writing and the like, until you're all up to par. After that, we'll move on to history, the shinobi code, as well as some of the theories that will help you to master the jutsu that you'll be learning next year. Also, you will be introduced to some of the basics taijutsu and weapons use." Naruto had to force himself not to groan. With the possible exception of taijutsu, there was really very little reason for them to attend if this was all they were going to learn. Although he was unsure of his exact skill level in relation to other children his age, he could state with confidence that he was significantly better than everyone else in the room in terms of reading, writing, and other fundamentals. Perhaps not the Irukas, but even so, he would wager that they were comparable. Iruka saw that most of his students were about to express their disapproval of having to take a test on their first day, so he quickly added, "So then, just so I can get a sense of just what level you're all on, I'm going to be handing out a small quiz, and don't worry, it doesn't count toward your grade, it's just to help me decide what I should teach first." The sheets of paper moved around the room in a matter of minutes. Unfortunately, Naruto only needed to take one glance. To be honest, this was just depressing. All of the questions were the most simple he had ever seen. Really, is 3 plus 4 plus 8 the level we should be at this age? This is utterly pointless. It would have been easy to convert it into an algebraic expression by simply inserting an x and the solution somewhere. This was simply not going to work. Even though Naruto didn't want to brag, Kiba had just learned that this test was an insult to his intelligence, and he wasn't going to put up with it. After an hour or so, Iruka gave the class instructions to turn in their work. This procedure only took a few minutes, and Iruka dismissed his class for their morning break as soon as he was certain he had them all. As far as Naruto was concerned, this was uncharted territory. There were quite a few trees surrounding the fence that surrounded the entire area, but the majority of the grounds behind the academy were open space. But what had caught him off guard was the sight of so many children playing together while running around. Though he found studying the characteristics of the plants that grew around the village to be endlessly fascinating, he knew that it couldn't be considered playing, even though he had enjoyed himself. It had been years since he had done anything that could be called playing. Additionally, he had never played with anyone else before beginning his studies. He hoped to find someone with whom he could at least have a thoughtful conversation, but he had no desire to run around like some maniac. He therefore moved to the edge of the academy grounds, where it was comparatively quiet and he could see the rest of the playground, with at least some sort of objective in mind. At that moment, he saw Shino, one of the other students in his class, standing alone by a big stand of trees. He began to approach the quiet boy after concluding that he was the only option that would not require him to run around like a fool. As he approached, he saw that the other boy appeared to have discovered something intriguing on one of the numerous bushes in their immediate vicinity. He didn't realize the boy appeared to be studying some sort of bug until he was standing right behind him. Naruto said, "I think it's a red flower beetle, but I'm no expert." Shino turned and raised an eyebrow at him. There is a hint of surprise in his voice as he says, "Actually it's a cockchafer, but they do look alike." He held his hand out and said, "Ah, well, like I said, I'm no expert. I'm Naruto, by the way." He firmly shook Naruto's hand after saying, "I know, we were in the same class, remember, and I heard you introduce yourself there. However, it would be rude not to reintroduce myself. My name's Shino." In an attempt to strike up a discussion with at least some intellectual value, Naruto said, "Nice to meet you. So you're interested in bugs, I take it?" Naruto and the rest of his classmates were back in their classroom once more. But this time, Shino was sitting next to him. Even though he wouldn't consider the other bot a friend, he was at least engaging to converse with, even though it quickly became clear that he concentrated the majority of his research on entomology. "Well class, after going over your test I think I can safely say that you're all exactly where you should be for your age group. Just a few weeks polishing off some of your basic skills and we'll be able to move on to something new," Haruka said as everyone sat down. "Now everyone take out your textbook and turn to page 12, we'll start on." Around this time, Naruto stopped listing. He glanced at the page and found that he was already familiar with every idea it discussed. He told himself, "Well, I'm positive that there are much more productive things I could be doing with my time than this." He came up with one at that moment. So that the teacher couldn't see him, he propped the book up on his desk, rested his head on the desk, and dozed off. This was how the remainder of the day had gone. During class, he would either sleep or, if that was not feasible, work on his own projects. He would also spend the breaks with Shino. Now that the school day was coming to an end, he was eager to return to his clubhouse because he had a lot of studying to do. Fortunately, though, because of all the sleep he had received during the day, he was definitely planning on staying up much later than he usually would have. But it appeared that his plans would have to wait. Haruka was about to leave when he heard someone say, "Just a moment, Naruto." Fortunately, he was the last person in the class, so no one else was around to tease him. This served as a reminder that he still owed Kiba the insult from the beginning of the day. Maybe a paralytic in his lunch, he thought to himself. He didn't have much time to consider his retaliation, though, because Haruka quickly grabbed one of the papers from his desk and held it up to him. Haruka said, "Now, could you please explain everything to me?" To tell the truth, he had forgotten all about the quiz they had taken that morning. It wasn't much, a little basic algebra here, a more difficult word problem there, and even with the minor adjustments he made, the test was still incredibly simple. "Oh that? Well, it was way too easy and I was bored, so I spiced it up a bit." Astounded, Haruka said, "Spiced it up a bit? In just this test alone you've already proven that you know all of the first-year curriculum in both math and language, and I'm willing to bet that if I tested you in all the other subjects I would get the same result." He hadn't anticipated that. Wow. He was intelligent, to be sure, but there was still a lot more for him to learn. In fact, he was certain that he would need years to fully comprehend everything that Farinel discussed in his journal. "In fact, I was thinking of skipping you ahead a year. Of course I would have to test you on all the things that you would be learning this year to make sure, but if this quiz is any indication I don't really think that there's going to be much I will be able to teach you this year." Haruka spoke with an air of disbelief. All right, that had taken him by surprise. He knew he was great, but it was good to have someone else recognize it as well. He was skipped ahead a year after his very first day. Nevertheless, that type of thing had a way of drawing attention, and he had discovered early on that attention did not bring him any positive outcomes. "Wow, that's really cool, but I think you're exaggerating there, Haruka. Sensei, yay, I know I'm smart, but my physical skills aren't all that great and I'm in no hurry. So thanks, but I think I would just like to stay where I am for now." It was also accurate. The sooner he became a fully fledged ninja, the less time he would have to practice his own skill set. He had no taijutsu to speak of, had never even held a kunai, much less thrown one. He just nodded his head after Haruka gave him an unreadable look. Haruka smiled kindly and sent him on his way, saying, "Well, okay, if you're sure, but if you ever change your mind let me know and I'll see what I can do. Anyway, I think I've kept you here long enough now, so I'll see you tomorrow." He became aware of his error after he had run outside. The crowd of people gathered around the front door had completely slipped his mind. Regretfully, it appears that everyone who had been present that morning has made the decision to come back. He started to wade through the crowd, popping his collar and making himself appear as small as possible in the hopes that people would be too preoccupied with their own affairs to notice him. Unfortunately, this was not to be. Even as he moved through the crowd, he could sense the icy stares they were giving him and hear the whispers. Unfortunately, he could see that some of the parents were pointing him out to their kids, and even though he couldn't hear what they were saying, he was certain that his chances of making friends had just drastically decreased. He decided that there was no more use in trying to blend in, so he started moving as fast as he could. He broke out of the crowd of people and ran as fast as he could toward the Hokage monument. He returned quickly to his hiding place, which he should really call his home because he spent nearly 90% of his time there and it was far more comfortable than his previous apartment. Getting the place back in working order had required a lot of time and work, but the effort had been well worth it. Now that all the lights were operational, he hoped he would never have to fix one again because getting electrocuted was terrible. This also applied to all of the doors, including the transparent plastic ones. Fortunately, the seals that kept the place locked had only run out of chakra, but he had managed to get them to function again. Since the previous warden had left what amounted to the location's instruction manual on his desk, he was also grateful that he was the only one with the ability to open any of the doors. The largest alteration, though, was that what had once been a number of empty rooms and cells were now home to all of the equipment Farinell had left to accompany his notes. He had also been able to obtain some outdated equipment from the research center and the hospital. However, the old warden's office had to have been his favorite feature of the entire complex. Actually, not much had changed since he had discovered it. All he had done was dust it off and move all of his books to the wall. Mounted bookcase. His favorite room, however, was because of the large windows in the back wall that allowed him to see the entire main floor, which was much easier now that all the lights were functioning. He spent the majority of his time here, primarily studying. At this point, he was sitting there contemplating his first day. It would have been an understatement to say he was not impressed. He was persuaded that he would not be spending more time there than was necessary by the curriculum alone, even though the teacher had seemed kind. The other student, on the other hand, was certain that by tomorrow they would all be acting like Kiba. He believed that he might be able to make friends with Shino, but he thought the others were hopeless, and that was before their parents had even reached them. All things considered, he was not anticipating his next appearance. However, that was simply his life, and he had long since adapted to living alone. That didn't mean, however, that he had to accept it or even like it. However, the question arose as to how in the hell he was supposed to change their perceptions of him, particularly since he was unaware of the reasons behind their initial animosity. Something had to be there, though. Initially, the thought occurred to him as he looked at the old journal. He laughed and dismissed the idea as a joke, thinking, well, I bet if I turned them all into a bunch of walking corpses they would stop looking at me weird. However, he decided that he might as well give the idea a little more thought after spending more than 2 hours in his cozy leather chair and failing to think of anything else. He was still going strong at nearly 4 in the morning. The idea only grew stronger in his mind as the minutes turned into hours, even though he had only started doing this to try to get it out of his head so he could think of something else. He was now looking down at his desk, which was covered in several papers that initially appeared to be the extensive writing of a madman. The bare outline of what must have been the most intricate, twisted, and completely crazy plane that had ever existed was visible to him in the confusion of theories and ideas. Only a crazy person would ever entertain a plan with so many flaws and thousands of variables, so he was certain that somewhere along the line he had gone completely insane. There were very few, if any, chances that this would work because everything hinged on things going exactly as planned. However, despite all of this knowledge, he was unable to discard the idea. Even though there were complications and a great deal of danger, the idea of it working at all made him shudder. He wasn't quite sure when it had shifted from being about getting the village to accept him to becoming a means of making everyone else feel as alone as he did. It terrified him to no end to think that he had even been able to consider doing something like this, much less put it into action. Despite his lack of empathy and his willingness to acknowledge that his years of studying things that the rest of the world was unaware existed had made him somewhat conceited, he still considered himself to be a decent person overall. However, there was nearly unquestionable evidence staring him in the face that proved that belief to be incorrect, and for the first time in his life, he genuinely considered the possibility that the villagers had been correct to shun him. No, that can't be true. They treated me the same way when I was younger. No, he thought to himself, It's all their fault. They made me like this. It made sense because, although he wasn't very good at psychology or anything like that, he was certain that someone couldn't benefit from long-term isolation, the kind of isolation he had been living in his entire life. It made sense at the time that he might have turned into a bad person, but since they had shaped him in that way, they really had no right to object if he carried out his crazy scheme. Regardless, it was getting late, and despite all the extra sleep he had received in class, he was still alert and prepared for bed. After taking one last glance at the jumble of papers that covered his desk, he switched off the desk light, got up, and moved toward the door leading to the room he had transformed into his sleeping quarters. However, he took one last look at his desk before shutting the door, and he was certain that he wouldn't be at the academy in the morning.
So that's it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe to the channel for more awesome stories like this. Thank you. See you all in my next video.